Hello, and welcome to the NCSS C3 Collaborative Literacy Professional Development Webinar, Meeting the Common Core for ELA Part 4, Reading, Writing, Speaking, and Listening Skills for English Learners and Native Speakers. This webinar, along with others in our series, are part of the College, Career, and Civic Life Framework for Social Studies State Standards Literacy Collaborative, C3LC, which NCSS is implementing in collaboration with the National Center for Literacy and Education, and which is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. My name is Anna Post, and I am the Director of External Relations and Council Communications at NCSS, as well as this grants project coordinator. The goal of this initiative is to create and operationalize a plan designed specifically for social studies teachers to implement the Common Core State Standards for English Language Arts by utilizing the C3 framework. This webinar is produced in conjunction with an in-depth investigation that can be accessed by C3LC project teacher groups at the Literacy and Learning Exchange site. Non-project participants will also be able to access the project activities and learning modules at the Exchange site or at the NCSS C3LC webpage. Links to these web locations will be provided at the end of the webinar. We are so pleased to have Dr. Barbara Cruz and Dr. Stephen Thornton doing this presentation today. Let me now turn over the microphone to them for some introductions and their presentation.
Hello, and welcome to this professional development module, Reading, Writing, Speaking, and Listening Skills for English Learners and Native Speakers. We are Barbara Cruz and Stephen Thornton, professors of social studies education at the University of South Florida. Much of our work for the past 10 years has focused on the unique characteristics of English learners and the distinct learning needs they have in the social studies classroom. Our interest stems from having worked with English learners in the United States and abroad, and that we also both happen to be immigrants. And in my case, I happen to be an English learner myself, having come to the United States in the middle of my kindergarten year. Much of our work is based on our lived experience as teachers, specifically as social studies teachers. We've written a book about English learners for teachers published by Routledge, a social studies textbook for English learners published by Cengage and National Geographic, and several articles for NCSS. We are happy to give you more information about this work if you send us an email, and we will be sharing this email again with you at the end of this webinar. You can also follow up with any questions or comments you have at the emails listed.
Through this module, we will share with you how you might consider English learners as well as native speakers as you implement the College, Career, and Civic Life, or C3 framework for social studies and the Common Core State Standards. The purpose of our webinar today is to provide an overview of the unique characteristics of English learners, their distinct learning needs, and how the integration of the C3 framework and the Common Core State Standards can be implemented in the social studies classroom. Before we get going on that, though, we wanted to do a little poll and ask you to weigh in. Specifically, we'd like you to reflect on past and current linguistically diverse students you have taught, or maybe know about if you haven't had them in your own classroom. The questions we'd like you to respond to were: where were the students from? What home languages did they speak? Were the students immigrants, or were they born in the United States? Let me repeat those. Where were they from? What home languages did they speak? And were the students immigrants, or were they born in the United States? Just pause for a minute now while you have a chance to respond in the box for polling.
So we see one, that most of my students have been immigrants from Mexico, or they were born here and their parents are immigrants. They speak Spanish. We see someone else who has had a variety of immigrant students from Bangladesh, Vietnam, Latin America, Southeast Asia, West Africa. Okay, good. Well, many of the student characteristics you noted are in keeping with what we know about K-12 English learners in the United States. And we see another one that just came in. Navajo Indians, many students in an adult setting. They were from almost every continent. Newcomer students from Haiti. Terrific. Yes, definitely. Great variety. So to start with, we'd like to share with you some basic demographic information about the student population that can inform our work as educators. You'll see that some of this info will confirm what you've already experienced, and in some cases, it might shed new light. So let's start off with this chart that very dramatically depicts the increase in the number of English learners enrolled in our schools. From the 1997-98 school year to the 2008-09 school year, the number of English learners enrolled in public schools increased from 3.5 million to 5.3 million, or by 51%. In comparison, during that same period, the general population of students grew to 49.5 million, or by 7.2%. So 51% as compared to 7.2%. Some fast facts that can help paint a more complete picture. 1 in 4 school-age children in the United States is an immigrant, so it's very likely that you as a teacher will have had an immigrant student in your class. Most children of immigrants do not speak English at home. That was certainly the case in my own home as I was growing up. My siblings and I only spoke Spanish with our parents. The majority, 75% of the English language population, was born in the United States. 66% of English learners are Latino, and the states with the highest numbers of English learners are California, Texas, Florida, New York, Illinois, and Arizona. Now, while 3 out of 4 English learners speak Spanish as their home language, virtually all languages in the world are represented in our schools. You can see some of those in this chart, but as examples, Seattle Public Schools in Washington have students from more than 98 countries who speak more than 129 languages. There are 169 native languages spoken by students in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools in North Carolina. In Fairfax County, Virginia, over 170 languages are spoken at home by students and their families. And in our own community of Tampa Bay, Florida, we have schools with significant Bosnian, Greek, Indian, Middle Eastern populations, all having special needs and offering unique opportunities for social studies connections. So depending on where you go in our country, there may be significant pockets of other languages as well.
Immigrant students are also, we should remember, likely to be facing a series of adjustments in their new country. Immigrant students come to America for various reasons, and this can have a significant impact on their adjustment to school and to life in the United States generally. For example, did they have a choice in immigrating? Did they win, for example, a so-called immigration lottery? Is there civil or military strife in their home country? Do their parents have educational or professional degrees? Did they immigrate with the family intact, or were they separated? Who did they leave behind? Not just separation from their parents and siblings, but also their grandparents and other extended family to whom they may have been close. Some immigrant students talk about having so-called immigrant guilt, worrying about those left behind. Have they lost status by coming to the United States? Those who came from middle or upper class backgrounds in their home country often find themselves in the U.S. occupying a lower socioeconomic role than they were accustomed to, which can be, to say the least, a difficult adjustment. 2/3 of all English learners in the United States, it should be remembered, however, are from low-income families, regardless of what status they held in their country of origin. Are they facing discrimination in their new country? Some communities are more challenging than others. Smaller towns and cities may or may not be worse. Large metropolitan cities may have more services and other immigrants, but smaller communities, research shows, often welcome new immigrants. How old are they? The age at immigration is also important. Late arrival immigrants, that is 14 years and older, for example, may experience more hardships, both linguistic and social, than younger students are likely to encounter. What is their existing proficiency in English? Some students come in with at least a rudimentary understanding of English, which helps tremendously. Being familiar with the English alphabet also helps, and many students, of course, come from lands where the English alphabet is quite foreign. What were their prior educational experiences? Those who enter at or near grade level often have received schooling in their home country, and these skills, on the whole, transfer to the new situation and hasten learning English, that is. Those with little formal education in their home country, however, are likely to have a more difficult time learning English and keeping up in U.S. schools with the curriculum.
And so I wanted to piggyback on what Steve was just talking about with respect to educational backgrounds. The uneven educational backgrounds of English learners in a given classroom or school need to be taken into account. You may find that some English learners have received excellent schooling in their home countries, while others have received poor or little formal schooling. Some English learners, especially political refugees, have probably had their education disrupted by civil or military strife. Some English learners may have some limited understanding of English from having studied it in their home country, while others have never been exposed to it. And finally, some languages use a very different system for written language than that used in English. You can see here just 3 examples from left to right: Arabic, Tagalog, and Korean. Learning a new system for expressing written language can be quite taxing, as many of us know when we studied a foreign language ourselves. Contrary to popular belief, adult learners can actually acquire academic language faster than children because of advanced cognitive development and possible prior experience in academia in their native language. Having linguistic and academic schema already in place helps tremendously in learning a new language. So we wanted to stop for a few minutes and ask you, what have been the schooling backgrounds of English learners you have had or know about? Had they had prior schooling? Had they had a formal schooling? Had they studied English perhaps before in their home country, in their country of origin? So think for a moment about some of the schooling backgrounds of the English learners with whom you've worked. And go ahead and type in your responses in the poll box. So that's very telling. The very first answer posted, some have never even held a pencil, and others were on the PhD level. So they had had quite a bit of schooling. I have taught students with formal schooling in their native country. However, most of the newcomer ELL students I taught had limited experiences with formal schooling. So again, it's this uneven background that poses an extra challenge for us as educators. They came in others' papers, so they were not the actual age of their classmates. Sure, that happens quite a bit. Some of them have had a basic English class, but very low. Or they have had limited English because they might have come from Bangladesh or some Spanish. All of these comments are exactly on point.
We find that not only do English learners vary as to where they were born and what kind of background they came from, and what amount of schooling and what kind of schooling they may have had, but they also vary in another important sense. One of the things you might have noticed about English learners with whom you've worked is that the level of proficiency they display in social situations may be very different from what they exhibit in the classroom. So, we will now turn our attention to BICS and Kelp, which I'll explain in a moment. They're acronyms first coined by Dr. Jim Cummins, a professor at the University of Toronto in Ontario, Canada. BICS stands for Basic Interpersonal Communicative Skills. It is characterized by context-embedded language, cognitively undemanding language, commonly used daily language, and informal situations where it is spoken. It takes generally about 2 years for a student, an English learner, to acquire BICS. And remember, when we say 2 years, 2 years is an average, so for some it can be 12 months, for some it can be 3 years. Kelp, on the other hand, and I'm going to give you some examples of all of this, Kelp and BICS, in a moment. Kelp stands for Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency and is characterized by context-reduced language, cognitively demanding language. It is common in school settings, and it is usually heard in formal situations. In other words, it's more or less the opposite of BICS, and it takes much longer to learn, on average about 7 years to acquire Kelp. Using Dr. Cummins' ideas about BICS and Kelp, he developed a quadrant model to help illustrate the degree of context and of cognition demands on English learners. So, for example, if we look at the chart, in the northwest or upper left quadrant are tasks that are cognitively undemanding and also easier because they are context embedded. These are the easiest language tasks, in other words. For example, copying from the board, selecting food in the lunchroom, and face-to-face conversation with a friend. Undoubtedly, these activities would be the easiest for students to accomplish, and educators sometimes wrongly assume because students are competent in this quadrant that therefore their English is much more generalizable than in fact it turns out to be. Moving clockwise to the northeast or upper right quadrant is also a cognitively undemanding domain, but it is more complex than the northeast quadrant because it is context reduced. For example, following a class schedule, chatting on the phone with a friend, and oral presentation. Moving clockwise again to the lower right or southeast quadrant, it is the most difficult. It is both cognitively demanding and context reduced. For example, standardized tests, listening to a lecture, phone conversation with a government agency, and reading a class textbook. Those in the lower right quadrant would be the most difficult for English learners, as they are, for that matter, for native speakers. Finally, in the southwest or lower left quadrant, we're still in an area that is cognitively demanding, but what has been called the cognitive load is reduced by it being context embedded. For example, analyzing a photo, reading a map, interpreting a chart, demonstrations, and object-based learning. Teachers should stress this quadrant in their classrooms whenever they can, because it allows a high level of thinking, yet a lower cognitive load than in many of the other areas. It is worth, of course, thinking about the cognitive load of social studies, because social studies, it has been shown by a number of research studies, is found more difficult by English learners than the other major subjects in the curriculum. And if we think about it for a moment, we can see why social studies, whether it be history or economics or geography and so forth, poses special challenges for English learners. Our field, in other words, has a high cognitive load. All too often it is a field dominated by lecture and textbook-based questioning, and most social studies classrooms are ill-stocked with visuals and manipulatives. So in other words, to put it another way, we have high cognitive load, but not much contextual support. Plus, a disproportionate amount of social studies language deals with abstractions, such as liberty, justice, free enterprise, manifest destiny, and so forth, which are things you can't readily, for example, point to a picture of. So the bottom line is that English learners require differentiated instruction and need access to specialized materials that make the curriculum more comprehensible to them.
Now, what we'd like to do is to have you view a video clip from the University of South Florida's The Language of ELL series. In this 3-minute clip, the middle school student from Poland is reading aloud from a passage about driving from California to Oregon. As you view, we want you to keep 2 questions in mind. First question, from what you can discern, what accommodations are being used to help the student comprehend the text? And the second question is, what other accommodations might be used to assist the student comprehend the text? So keep these questions in mind while you watch this 3-minute clip.
Okay, Isabella, let's read a story. But before we start reading the story, could you look at the picture and tell me what do you think the story is about?
I think it's about family.
Good. Are there any children in this family?
Yes.
How many?
3.
Can you tell me something more about them?
It's 2 girls and 1 boy.
Okay, good. And what do you think is the last name of the family? What is the name of the family?
Zimmer.
Zimmer. How do you know?
I don't know.
It's in the title, that's right.
Yes.
Okay, could you read the story for us?
Mr. and Mr. Zimmer are in a van with their 3 children. They are driving from California to Oregon. It is late at night. Mr. Zimmer is in the front seat. They is driving the van. Mr. Zimmer and the children are in the back seats. They are sleeping. Mr. Zimmer is hungry.
Okay, let me ask you several questions. Are Mr. and Mrs. Zimmer traveling by an airplane?
No,
How do they travel?
I don't know.
By a train?
No.
Do they travel by a car?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. How many children do they have?
3.
Good. And where are they going to?
To the restaurant.
Okay. And where are they from?
California.
They are from California, very well. And you said that they are going to the restaurant, right? What kind of restaurant is it?
Fast food restaurant.
What kind of food do they have in the fast food restaurants?
I think hamburgers and French fries, Coke.
Good. And did they go together in the restaurant?
Yes.
Okay. And was it in the morning or at night?
In the morning.
In the morning? Good. And was the restaurant in Oregon because they are going to Oregon, or the restaurant was in California?
I don't know.
You don't know? Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so as you viewed, hopefully you remembered the questions. So first of all, from what you can discern, from what you were able to see and hear, what accommodations were used to help the student comprehend the text? That's the first question. And then also, if you've had experience in this in particular, what other accommodations might be used to assist the student in comprehending the text? And go ahead and enter your responses in the poll boxes. Okay, so several of you are pointing out the picture, the visuals. That helped tremendously in giving the student an idea of what was going to be found in the reading passage.
And previewing the skills, that too is a very important step.
Right. The fact that the questions were well scaffolded. Yes, definitely. And now we can see in the other dialog box there what our other accommodations might have been used. So pre-teaching the vocabulary. Yes, so picking out some of the words that the teacher thought that perhaps the student might not know and pre-teaching those words so that when the student came across them, she would understand them. Using prompts and illustrations. Right, and we want you to note too, by the way, that when students are at this level of language production, they may say that they do not know an answer, but in reality, it's that they don't have the language to express it. So notice that the student knew that the family's name was Zimmer. But when she was asked how she knew this information, where she found it, she said, I don't know. Because she didn't know the word title, as in, oh, Zimmer, the family's name, is in the title of the story. So since she couldn't say all of that, she said, I don't know. And several of you pointed out the visuals, the illustrations. Definitely, that is a very big plus in the work that we do with ELLs. Okay, so let's talk now about some of the top strategies that we have found in our work for teaching reading and writing in the social studies. You all noticed that the student used the illustration in the reading to comprehend the text. Having illustrations and other visuals are very, very helpful. These are 5 strategies that we have found to be particularly useful. The first one is pre-reading. As the term implies, it occurs before the student engages in a reading passage. It can encompass posing focus questions, activating prior knowledge, defining unfamiliar vocabulary, as several of you pointed out in your comments. These are all effective pre-reading strategies. Considerate text. Steve and I came across this term and this approach when we were writing a book for Cengage National Geographic. This is text that can be seen as reader-friendly. It's simplified text. It uses active voice. It incorporates titles and subtitles and headers and visual aids. All of these are features of considerate text. Pre-writing. Here, this entails having students brainstorm, outline, and free write first, helping them to organize their thoughts into coherent writing. These are strategies that are not only helpful for ELs, of course, but for native speakers as well. Graphic organizers. These are one of our favorite strategies. There's a wide variety of graphic organizers that can help students classify and organize ideas, whether those they read or those they plan to write about. In the social studies, some of the most useful graphic organizers include compare and contrast tables, cause and effect charts, Venn diagrams, and a variation on the KWL chart, the KWL-QH chart. The Q and the H stands for questioning. What other questions do I have? And H stands for how. How may I find out more information on this topic? And then we get to vocabulary development. We believe that this is key to content comprehension. Even before students understand pronunciation, syntax, grammar, other fundamentals of language, if they have some words they recognize, they can often figure out the meanings of sentences. Think about when you have been in another country and you do not understand the language, how if you can pick out certain words and you know what they mean, you can kind of try to start piecing together some meaning. Although time doesn't permit us to go into each of these strategies, we would like to highlight vocabulary development because we believe it's so, so important, especially for the highly specialized vocabulary prevalent in the social studies. So for example, here's a strategy that we have found to be very useful. You can start this at the beginning of a unit or before reading a text. It requires the teacher to identify some key vocabulary that the student will encounter. You can put those in the left-hand column where it says word or term. Students can reflect, do I know this word? Am I not sure? Oh, for sure I don't know this word. Check the appropriate column. Find the definition. So that then finally, As they encounter these terms, they'll know what these words mean. And once the unit or the reading is complete, this can serve as a customized, personalized dictionary for students. And of course, each student's chart can be different based on their language proficiency. We've also been in classroom where word walls have been used very, very effectively. They can be of value for all students, especially if the words are outside the regular course of study. You can see two examples here. Typically, words included are high-frequency vocabulary words that are used in a unit of study. Brief definitions should accompany accurate spellings, of course. In some classrooms, including visuals is also appropriate. And they're most effective if created and maintained by students. Even though it could be started by the teacher for demonstration purposes, having students maintain it will create ownership. We also like the strategy of a word wheel. This gives students a deep and rich understanding of vocabulary by having them not only learn a word's meaning, but also identify illustrative visuals, find synonyms and antonyms, and use the word in a sentence, showing their comprehension of the term. We suggest that the process can first be modeled by the teacher, and as the semester and year progress, the students can create their own in their own student journals, and again, create their own personalized dictionaries that can be used in a variety of ways.
Now, we'd like to show you another video clip from the University of South Florida's The Language of ELL series. In this 3.5-minute clip, the elementary school student from Peru is exhibiting early production language ability in a conversation. We want you to note especially the frequency of one-word responses and very short replies to questions, as well as his pronunciation of certain words. Note that the boy seems most confident answering questions about himself and his family, indicating Bix in other words. It is when the questions require Kelp that you will hear the student mumbling at times, showing lower confidence. He is still in the process of learning past tense and subject-verb agreement, and when asked to describe the picture, he mainly points and labels things he sees without producing complete sentences. As you view this video clip and reflect on students who have limited expressive language ability, we would like for you to keep the following question in mind. What implications do your students' language abilities have for your classroom as you develop questioning strategies and facilitate discussions? So, here we have the clip.
What country did you come from? Where were you born?
Peru.
Peru, okay. And how long have you been in the United States?
Less of a year.
Less than 1 year, right?
Yeah.
I think you came in August, didn't you?
October.
October. Oh, hadn't even been that long. Okay, you're right. Boy, things go by fast. Do you have any brothers and sisters?
I have one brother and one sister.
Okay, and how old is your brother?
He's here.
Okay, he's in 5th grade.
Yeah.
And how old is your sister?
My sister is little. She have 2 years or
She's
1 year.
2 years old or 1 year old? Okay, so she's young.
Yeah, but she's in Peru.
She's in Peru. So who's in the United States with you?
My mother.
Your mother and your brother,
My brother.
right? Okay, so the three of you are here. And what language do you speak?
I speak Spanish.
You speak Spanish, okay. When you're at home, do you speak English or Spanish?
They too.
Do you speak Spanish with your mom at home?
Yeah.
What about with your brother?
Yeah, I speak Spanish too.
So you speak Spanish at home, and then when you come to school, you speak English, yes. And is it easy for you to speak English?
Yeah.
Yes? Okay. And let's see, what else can I ask you that I was interested in knowing? Last week we had spring break. What did you do on spring break?
I go with my mother put a game We go to Blockbuster.
So you went where?
Blockbuster.
Blockbusters. Okay, what did you do at Blockbusters?
One movie, the movies, Looney Tunes back in action.
Looney Tunes, spaghetti action?
Back in action.
Mrs. Mueller doesn't watch many movies. I didn't know. So you watched movies over spring break.
Yeah.
Did you do anything else?
Well, no.
Did you go anywhere?
Yeah, I go to only one restaurant.
You went to a restaurant. Okay, so you went out to eat?
Yeah.
Well, that's good. And you didn't go to Busch Gardens? I have a picture here.
Okay.
And I would like for you to look at it and to tell me something about it. Describe what you see.
Dinosaurs. Everything. Someone is right here.
Okay. Someone is
Balls, books, pencils.
What is that called? Do you know? Puzzle.
Puzzle.
Okay. What else do you see?
Shells.
Okay. What else?
Animals.
Okay. Where do you think this picture is taking place? Where?
A classroom.
Okay. Why a classroom?
It don't have things of one classroom.
Okay. That's the things that you would find in a classroom. Okay. Thank you.
So, what implication do your students' language abilities have for your classroom as you develop questioning strategies and facilitate discussions?
Okay, so you've got the poll box there. So think about if you have different language production abilities in your classroom. What implications might that have?
This is another example, really, of the variety among English language learners with what linguists call their levels of speech emergence.
Okay, good. Yes, ask questions in multiple ways. And right, there's got to be a lot of support and scaffolding to help students at different ability levels be able to formulate sentences.
Okay. Yes. The importance of rewording, of saying things in different ways, of using body language, of urging repetition, and so forth. All of these are part of what you can use successfully. And visuals and simplified language, of course, are coin of the realm in this regard. No doubt you're thinking about the various levels of speech emergence that you have personally witnessed in classrooms. Language scholars have devised various models for categorizing students' linguistic abilities. All of their schemes have merits, but we'd like to share with you a model suggested by Krashen and Terrell in 1983 and used since by many educators. If we have a look at this chart, it suggests, as Krashen and Terrell did, that it may be useful to think of English learners as falling into four broad categories. The four levels range from pre-production to intermediate fluency, with pre-production being the earliest and intermediate fluency the closest, as the fluency part indicates, to native speech. Pre-production applies to English learners who are unfamiliar with English. Early production entails response in one or two word answers and short utterances. Note, though, that compared to pre-production speakers, their receptive vocabulary has grown. And let me just underscore that. We've used that word before, that the receptive vocabulary may be significantly larger than the expressive vocabulary. In other words, what they hear and can understand may be considerably more than they can speak and produce. English learners in speech emergence have a significant receptive vocabulary, and they can produce language more freely than in the previous stage. English learners in the fourth column there, intermediate fluency, have near native-like fluency in everyday social English, but not in academic English. These levels of linguistic ability have implications for teaching strategies, as you can see on the chart. We invite you to revisit this chart later when we will have a bit more time to look at it in some detail. But for now, let us talk about some of the top strategies that scaffold and help develop students' speaking and listening skills. The ones that we've found to be most useful are the following 6. First, the term that's already come up in the polling boxes, sheltered instruction. By this we mean using comprehensible content and strategies to teach grade-level subject matter in English, while simultaneously also developing English language skills. As an example, if you were teaching a unit on the New Deal, you might use gestures and manipulatives, body language, as somebody suggested in the polling, and perhaps visuals, such as a photograph of the Civilian Conservation Corps planting trees, or a poster of the Works Progress Administration, suggestive of what the activities and spirit of the New Deal were about. A second is visual resources. And here, Barbara and I have actually written a number of articles where we've emphasized the vast range of things people can learn from visual resources with a wee bit of imagination on the teacher's part. So you might use a wartime poster of Rosie the Riveter, or a photograph of the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, or a painting of a 19th century industrial landscape. Each of these can be used to provide context and aid comprehension. Third is demonstrations. As an example, use a globe to show the Great Circle route from a voyage across the Atlantic from Liverpool, England to New York City, versus drawing a straight line on a Mercator projection map. This simple demonstration can convey an important point about distance and transatlantic travel, and so forth. Fourth, realia. Reproductions of vases, for example, from classical Greece, or a coconut that's floated across the Pacific Islands from one to the other, or a boomerang from Australia. Each of these artifacts can be used, and they don't have to be real realia. Each of these artifacts can be used to not only promote interest in the regions, but also encourage deep thinking about the associated cultures and way of life that are from the lands where they come from. Next, stratified questions. By stratified questions, we mean questions that are composed with the various levels of language abilities in mind, the 4 that we just talked about, pre-production, intermediate fluency, and so forth. For example, a picture of a 19th century industrial landscape might show a train and smoke from the locomotive and so forth, and you might ask a pre-production English learner to point to the train, or to point to the smoke in the air. Pointing, I'd like to add here, is not an insignificant learning tool. That many concepts can be got across by the simple fact of pointing at things in visuals. It isn't merely a matter of naked identification. With just a bit of forethought then, teachers can compose questioning strategies where all students can contribute something significant to the conceptual content of the lesson. Finally, cooperative learning, which offers particular advantages in classes with mixed language groups at different levels. Heterogeneous groups can be useful for both English language learners as well as native speakers, of course. For example, using the same 19th century industrial landscape picture I just talked about with the train and smoke in the air, students from mixed linguistic ability levels can work together to produce a word list that would describe the painting. We have found that in these mixed small groups that English learners are more comfortable in practicing their language skills than in a whole class situation. And native speakers often use the opportunity to delve deeper into topics and solidify their own learning.
We know that everyone who is logged on tonight has had some experience in one way or the other in working with English learners, and we'd like to hear from you. What is one strategy that you have found particularly useful when modifying your lessons to meet the needs of English learners in your classroom? So we're going to start a poll, and we'd like for you to share these strategies. Pick one of your top ones. What is a strategy that you have found really useful when you've modified an existing lesson that you teach, that you've developed, to meet the needs of English learners in your classroom? It could be a general approach. It can be a particular strategy that you use in your social studies classroom. Wonderful. So using YouTube to find video clips that can illustrate concepts. Absolutely. Asking questions in multiple ways. Incorporating the arts. Absolutely support that one. That's terrific. Art, drama, poetry. Making curricular modifications to be more inclusive of the students' cultural backgrounds, linguistic backgrounds. Yes, everyone in the classroom will be enriched by that. Getting some of the background knowledge with a survey or a think, pair, share about a key topic. Yes, using Google Translate, which can sometimes come up with some very interesting translations, but can be very, very helpful. Yep. Okay, these are all great ideas, and I'm sure that if we sat here, we'd come up with even more. I wish we had many, many more hours to spend together, because I know that this group has a lot of experience. So you can see that with just the responses that we collected in just that minute or two, how with just a little bit of forethought, lessons can be successfully modified to meet students' needs. And what we'd like to do is offer you this checklist that we use to ensure that the key elements important for English learners are covered in a given lesson plan. To our minds, these are the key components that you want to make sure are addressed when you modify your lessons. So the very first thing is, does your lesson plan have a language objective? As social studies educators, of course, we're great about including social studies objectives. But for example, using the word wheel, I mentioned earlier, students might learn about synonyms or antonyms during a given social studies lesson. And that's just a very simple one. But all lesson plans should have a lesson objective as well as a social studies objective. A language objective. Yes, sorry. It should also take into consideration students' levels of English proficiency. As we mentioned with stratified questioning strategies, it's important that all students be provided with opportunities to contribute in the classroom and also to show what they've learned. More on that in a second. Does the lesson provide specialized materials for English learners? Fortunately, more and more publishers and school districts are producing these materials that are enormously helpful for English learners and native speakers alike. But they can also be created by teachers and students themselves, as we showed with the word walls or the word wheels, for example. Several of you have noticed the importance of pictorials. So does the lesson include visuals? We can't stress the importance enough. And the internet now makes the identification and capturing of visuals for educational use easier than ever before. Does the lesson feature comprehensible input by the teacher? So in addition to the specialized materials, teachers need to monitor their own language, the speed of information presentation, the use of colloquial expressions, and other linguistic practices that we don't often stop to think about. Does the lesson make connections between school and home cultures? And there were several comments tonight that were offered by the participants in tonight's webinar that got at this. While it's true that having English learners in our classrooms can pose challenges for us as educators, it's also true that their diversity of experience, culture, history, and language can also enrich our social studies classrooms. Whenever possible, making these connections not only supports English language learners' learning, but also enhances our social studies instruction. Does the lesson have assessments appropriate for language ability? Of course, we need to help all of our students be able to show their knowledge and skills on traditional pencil and paper tests. However, we also need to provide alternative formats and forms of assessment so that English learners can demonstrate their growth in language-appropriate ways. And then, does the lesson give English learners and native speakers opportunities to develop reading and writing, speaking, and listening? More and more, these connections to the Common Core State Standards and to the C3 framework are crucial.
In conclusion, both the Common Core standards, most applicable to social studies, and the C3 framework demand active student involvement with texts and skills, not mere identification of information. These are tall enough orders for social studies instruction for any students. However, their likely unfamiliarity with key facets of American culture, coupled with the high cognitive load of textual materials, can create daunting challenges for English learners. But our work over the last 10 years has nonetheless convinced us that the goals of the Common Core and the C3 framework, with sensible accommodations and not without effort to be sure, are still open to English learners.
If there are any resources we've mentioned tonight that you would like to receive more information about, please write to us at the emails shown. We really look forward to hearing from you. We thank you for your participation, for your input and your thoughts. And we'd love to hear about the successes that you've had in your classrooms. So now, a few parting words from Anna, and we bid you good night.
Good night.
Thank you, Dr. Cruz and Dr. Thornton, for this wonderful presentation. What a rich experience. I just wanted to remind webinar participants that this webinar is produced in conjunction with an in-depth investigation that can be accessed by the C3LC project teacher groups at the Literacy and Learning Exchange site. Teachers who are not members of the pilot groups in the C3LC project can access the project activities and learning modules by creating a free account at the Literacy and Learning Exchange and then becoming a follower of the NCSS C3LC Collaborative Grant Project. And in addition, there is another way in which you can reach these materials and these wonderful archived webinars, and that is through our C3LC NCSS webpage. And that is available at the socialstudies.org/C3/C3LC. Thank you for attending and participating. We look forward to continued participation. If you have any questions whatsoever, please don't hesitate to be in touch with me.